Hey, folks, here I am, once again live. I don't know what happened to the other stream. It just froze and stopped. So, if somebody would mind posting the link to this new one in the old one and bringing all the folks from the old live that froze back to where we are. Maybe I was saying something folks don't care to hear. That's okay. I'm going to keep talking. Welcome, Kareem. Glad you're joining me on the new stream. I don't know why the other one wouldn't just resume, but here I am. Glad you're with me, Kareem. But yes, I'm asking somebody to please post the link in the chat of the other one so we can keep having our conversation. Kareem Moop says, I am the only person. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Well, please post the link. It says there's 14 of you here. The number is going up. So there you go. Plenty to keep talking about. Iris says hi. Jacob Masksy says, posted the link. Thank you, Jacob. Come on and join me here on the new live. Adam says, no, hashtag me too. Kinky says, back again. Welcome, Kinky. James Graham is back. Ron Wagoner is back. Giwa Mashood is back. Please join us, folks. I don't know what happened with that old stream. They cut it, and now here we are. Please bring more folks on board. I'm happy to talk. Owen Stevens is with us. Marcus Dalla is with us. Wow. Let your conspiracy theories run rampant. Lincolnite Yankee says howdy. Let your conspiracy theories run rampant. I'm apt to blame it on the poor quality of the iPhone rather than anything else. Birdworldist says, hey, one of your friends runs a blog. But yes, I'm more apt to blame this on the technical difficulties and the weakness of the iPhone. However, who knows, right? Maybe they don't like what I'm saying. But regardless, I left the link in the old one, says Mr. Bigger 48. Great. James Graham says share again. Lol, I get on him way. J24 says I'm back. No Orbit Class War says Huawei. I agree with you. Huawei or no way. But yes, folks, here we are. I've started a new stream because the old one froze. So here I am. Now, I don't know how I got 32 likes immediately. Tornado Nick says, there we go. But yes, please bring folks over to the new live. Lo and behold, here we are. We're streaming once again. Still got plenty to talk about. Not out of ammunition yet. Giwa Mashood says, Caleb, say something about Julian Assange. Okay, Giwa Mashood, I'll say something. I'm worried about Julian Assange. I am worried about Julian Assange. You know, Pamela Anderson, the U.S., I don't know what you want to call her, model, actress, met with him. She was quite worried about the case. If he's extradited to the United States, that's going to be particularly hard. What's waiting for him when he gets extradited to the United States? If you think this is simply about trying to crack a computer code and this is just all about computer hacking, I think you're deluding yourself. Julian Assange, he was hauled up in the embassy for 7 years, for goodness sakes, and now Julian Assange, lo and behold, is at this point, he's in the custody. He got this outrageous sentence for jumping bail. The judge refused to take into account the fact he'd been hauled up in the embassy for 7 years, and he's got 11 months in jail for not turning himself over. And it's particularly intense. We should all be concerned about Julian Assange. Now, at this point, a lot to say. I know someone was giving me a shout out from Brazil. Well, shout out to you. Now, Rory Lennon says Julian Assange never criticized Israel. Is that true? I could swear I saw Julian Assange criticizing Israel at some point. But there you go. But lo and behold, folks, yes, here we are in the new stream, about 4 minutes in. Can you please make a point of bringing more people in? Because at this point, it's saying there's only 5 of you here, and I'm seeing a lot more messages than just 5 people. So I'm wondering what's going on with my numbers here. But that's okay. I'm going to keep talking, even if there's just 5 of you. You 5 are my good friends. Now, somebody was asking me about a video that was made about socialism being American or not. I haven't watched the particular video they were referring to, but I might as well talk about the fact that I think that socialism is very American. I began one of my presentations in New York City about 2 years ago. About a year and a half ago, I began a presentation in New York City with the following words. I said, I'm going to recite for you some very radical words written by a very radical socialist. here in the United States in the year of 1892. And these words that he wrote, he hoped that people would chant them all over the United States. It would create unity, break down divisions, create a sense of solidarity, and also get rid of racism in the United States. And so he wrote these very, very radical words. And I asked the audience, I said, are you ready for these very, very radical words that were written in the United States in 1892? And I looked at the audience and I said, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And that is the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance. That is the original version of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance. Now, the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance now, contains the phrase "under God." That was added in the 1950s because it was considered to be a dig at communists. Communists were supposed to be atheists, so by adding "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, we were supposed to be making a dig at those commies. And "under God" was thrown in. The "under God, indivisible" is a line from the Gettysburg Address of Abraham Lincoln. But what's interesting about that is that in the Gettysburg Address, where Abraham Lincoln says, "one nation, under God, indivisible," it's actually not what it says in the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance, that he's basically saying, one nation, inshallah, indivisible, or one nation, if God wills it, God willing, indivisible. Gettysburg Address, you'll have to remember, was given when the USA was in a civil war with the South. And so Abraham Lincoln's saying, so we're one nation, indivisible, one nation, under God, indivisible, like one nation, indivisible, if God is on our side, if God wills it, if we can get out of this war. That's what he's saying. So he's not saying we're one nation because we're Christian, we're individual. That's not what he was getting at. But regardless, yes, the Pledge of Allegiance was written by Francis Bellamy. And Francis Bellamy was a Baptist minister who lived in the state of Boston, or he lived in Massachusetts, state of Massachusetts. And his sermons that he gave were all about how capitalism was evil. He hated capitalism. It was bad. It was, starving people, to the point that his church said that he was so radical and fiery that he was banned from the pulpit in Boston. And they would not allow him to continue preaching his sermons. So he left the city of Boston and he moved to Florida. And he started preaching his socialist sermons in the city of in Florida. And as he preached in Florida, he had another problem, because in Florida, that was the South, and they had segregation. And Francis Bellamy did not want to preach to segregated congregations. He didn't believe in racial segregation. Very much ahead of his time. Now, I know Francis Bellamy, unfortunately, for all of his pluses, he did make bigoted statements against Roman Catholics. He did not like Roman Catholics. He didn't believe in drinking alcohol. He was kind of bigoted against Catholic immigrants. He thought that Roman Catholics coming into the USA were going to somehow erode our morals. That's not a good thing. But what's more interesting about Francis Bellamy, the author of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance, what's interesting about him is that in addition to being the author of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance, he was the cousin of Edward Bellamy. Now, who is Edward Bellamy? Now, Edward Bellamy was the novelist. He wrote the book Looking Backward, which was very, very popular at that time in the 1880s. It was a best-selling book. It was sold almost as many copies as Ben-Hur, which was a very popular book back then. It was one of those popular novels in the United States. I read it, actually. Read it several times. And it's a science fiction novel. And it tells the story of this guy who falls asleep and is hypnotized and falls asleep, and then he wakes up in the year 2000. He goes from the year 1887 to the year 2000, and when he wakes up in the year 2000, the USA is socialist. It's a socialist country, and it's amazing, and they have all this fancy new technology. It's a sci-fi book, and it's socialist. It's a socialist sci-fi book, and it created a phenomenon in the United States. It was one of the most popular books at that time. We at that point had come out of the Civil War. Civil War was still fresh in our memory, and it was actually the cousin of this best-selling sci-fi socialist author, Edward Bellamy. It was his cousin, Francis Bellamy, who wrote the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance. And to be fair, Edward Bellamy is the official author. Francis Bellamy is the official author of the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance. However, to be fair, he took the words, and this is something that not many people know. He took the words from the Pledge of Allegiance from the oath that former Confederates had to take in order to get their voting rights back. Right? If you'd been a Confederate soldier, you'd taken up arms against the U.S. government, In order to get your right to vote back, you had to swear an oath of loyalty to the USA. And basically, every state had a different one. But the oath was a lot like what the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance is. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. And think about the next part. One nation, right? Well, technically, the USA is not a nation, right? But at the time, there was an upsurge, and that's actually what Edward Bellamy's movement was. It was the nationalist movement, they called it. The first big socialist movement in the USA was actually called the nationalist movement and the nationalist clubs. And their idea was they were going to forge an American nationality, where everyone, white, black, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Irish, Italian, German, whatever your religion was, we would be one nationality. So one nation, indivisible, that means no secessionism, right? Can't break away and form your own country. So you're, as a former Confederate, you're saying indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So no slavery. No slavery, right? Liberty and justice for all. The Pledge of Allegiance itself was a, kind of a middle finger. You were basically repudiating everything the South believed in. Slavery? No, you're swearing you believe in liberty and justice for all. You're indivisible. You're saying, you don't believe in states breaking away. One nation, you're saying that all the people here, white and black, are one nationality. Right? And it was an attempt, the nationalist movement of Edward Bellamy, centered around his novel, Looking Backward, was an attempt to create, in the aftermath of the nationalist upsurges in Europe, it was an attempt to build a kind of socialistic nationalism in the United States. And the Pledge of Allegiance, the idea that all the school kids in every school all across the country would be pledging allegiance to the flag of the United States every morning, it was a very progressive moment. Coming out of the overthrow of slavery, with the nationalist revolts of 1848 having happened all across Europe, it was a progressive moment, and that the Pledge of Allegiance, if you look at it, was a very, very progressive and radical thing. And it's funny, because I hated it as a kid. The main reason I hated it is I was in a very conservative area, and at the time there was talk of removing the under God clause, and so everyone would always say, under God, really loudly to, stick it to those liberals, and, and it was, I felt kind of uncomfortable about it, But looking back, if I'd actually known the actual history of the Pledge of Allegiance, it's pretty radical. It's pretty far left. No one knows that. No one talks about it. It's one of these things that we just go through life. It's considered to be, it's part of the conformity of U.S. society, and it is what it is. But regardless, the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance is actually a pretty radical thing. It's a repudiation of slavery. It's a repudiation of the Confederacy. It's written by a socialist, and it's an ideal to live up to. I don't think anyone really believes that right now in the United States we have liberty and justice for all, but the idea is that we will aspire to create liberty and justice for all, which at this point I think a lot of people in the USA don't believe in that. I think a lot of folks, unfortunately, in the USA don't want liberty and justice for all, as sad as it is. Now, I'm just going to throw this out there, folks. I don't normally get into the technical stuff of my YouTube, but I'm seeing the comments. All kinds of people are commenting here. I see that Kinky is there. I see all kinds of people commenting. But yet, the numbers here are telling me that there's only 5 people in this chat, and I know that that's not the case. That is very, very strange. YouTube is being rather interesting today. I don't know if they didn't like my earlier live or what's going on here, but there's no way that there's only 5 people here. Now, Jacob Maxey says it says 46. Interesting, because it's telling me only 5. That's pretty weird. But hey, what do you know? And Dan Uko is saying 45. Well, there you go. That's weird. So something's wrong with the way the numbers are being calculated. But hey, I'm having a great time here. I don't know what's going on, folks, and this is great. I'm going to keep talking. Now, I wanted to give a shout out to Marcus Dalla. And Marcus Dalla told me he was from Brazil. And if you're watching from Brazil, awesome. I'm glad you're here. That's great. Brazil, that's a country that's been through a lot of difficulties. I was actually able to visit Brazil in 2016. I gave a presentation to an amazing organization called the Trade Union Congress of Brazil, or the Trade Union Center of Brazil. It was amazing, and that book is now available. It's called, the text of my speech is now is available as a book. It's called Oil and the Global Capitalist Crisis. You can get it on Amazon. Exciting stuff. And I love, there's a lot of really progressive people in Brazil. Bolsonaro and his kind of, nasty right-wing, stuff, he doesn't represent all of Brazil. And the fact, all the polls showed that if the courts hadn't stepped in, Lula da Silva, the social democrat, would have won the next election. And the Workers' Party of Brazil at this point is even more radical than it was under Lula da Silva. I mean, it's very much the Communist Party alliance has really solidified, and Marcus is agreeing with me. Yes, Bolsonaro and his kind of right-wing stuff. He doesn't represent the people of Brazil. He represents one particular section of society, and on top of that, all the polls showed that if they'd allowed Lula da Silva to run for president, he would have won the election. So that goes to show you that not everything that U.S. media is telling you is the truth, lo and behold, right? And that in 2016, they ousted Dilma Rousseff from the Workers' Party. I was in Brazil just before that happened to give my talk. And they put in Michel Temer. And Michel Temer went in and he implemented neoliberalism. He started privatizing things, started ripping up the social democratic programs that had been created there in Brazil. And now it's 2018. So they've had 2 years of of deregulation, moving toward capitalism, moving toward neoliberal free market capitalism in Brazil. And has life in Brazil gotten any better? In Argentina, the Macri government has been in there ripping apart everything Christina Kirchner did, privatizing things, signing on with the IMF. It's a mess. Inflation, all of that, right? The Macri, the Argentina, U.S.-backed, anti-socialist, free market government has wrecked Argentina in the last few years. I don't even want to get... Honduras, since 2009, has grown to be the murder capital of the world. There's a higher murder rate than any other country in the Western Hemisphere almost, right? That since they overthrew Manuel Zelaya and brought free markets into Honduras, it's been a mess. Haiti is a free market country where things are so prosperous that people actually eat dirt mixed with oil. That's a common food that people eat in Haiti. That's how poor it is. Recently, the price of gasoline and fuel went up, and people were rioting in the streets because that was cutting into their food. They were having to choose between spending money on gasoline and food, and so there was rioting over that. Big problems all over capitalist South America, capitalist Latin America, capitalist Caribbean. Nobody ever in the U.S. media ever says that, that proves capitalism is bad. However, Venezuela has problems. Socialism did it. It's ridiculous. It's really ridiculous. Compare the way Cubans live, that's one Caribbean island, to the way Haitians live. Right? Both Caribbean islands, both, former colonies that have gotten their independence. Compare the living conditions of Haitians to the living conditions of Cubans. Right? They're making a huge deal about how they're having some shortages due to a renewed inability to import food in Cuba. I saw that. It's the news story, right? Cuba, they're having shortages on imports in Cuba. Well, lo and behold, Haitians have been starving to death and been eating dirt mixed with oil for decades. And no one goes in there and says, look what capitalism has been doing to Haiti. No one says that. The double standards are ridiculous, right? You go to Honduras. Since they removed Manuel Zelaya, the highest murder rate, it's the murder capital. You can read the articles about what's been going on there. It's just horrendous stuff that's happened. But, the U.S. press doesn't blame it. And another thing that was widely unreported in U.S. media, what country had the highest rate of GDP growth of any country in the year of 2018? Any South American country in 2018. What country in South America had the highest GDP growth rate? Bolivia. Evo Morales, who is just as radical as Maduro, right? Bolivia. And no one said, wow, they're having huge rates of GDP growth in Bolivia thanks to socialism. Nobody said that. They don't bother to report. U.S. media, when it comes to the issue of socialism versus capitalism, they're just lying. They cherry-pick facts to fit their narrative. When Venezuela was having huge amounts of economic growth, they ignored it. When Venezuela was having hardships, they said, look what happened because of socialism. Now that Bolivia is having huge amounts of economic growth, we're not hearing anything about it. But lo and behold, all over the capitalist world, we're seeing capitalist countries like Argentina, capitalist countries like Brazil, capitalist countries like Honduras, capitalist countries like Haiti, capitalist countries like Guatemala having huge problems, and no one says, that's because of capitalism. They're cherry-picking facts, and they're trying to push an ideological narrative, right? The belief in capitalism, neoliberalism, they are pushing an ideological narrative, trying to basically get, people to follow this belief that if we just privatize more things, everything will be great. If we just deregulate everything, we just let the free market operate, if we let corporations do whatever they want, it'll be a paradise. This capitalism, the unknown ideal, has never happened anywhere in the world. Capitalism has failed everywhere it's ever been tried, folks. Everywhere that they have implemented neoliberal free market reforms, the result has been people being miserable. Everything that they told you about communism is true about neoliberalism and capitalism. Everything they told you about communism, it's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. It results in an authoritarian police state and dictatorships. Whenever it fails, they just say, "Oh, that's not real." Everywhere it's ever been tried, lo and behold, folks, everywhere it's ever been tried, you have gotten things getting worse. Now, folks are tweeting, but what's interesting is, so now, it's funny. So before it told me I had only 5 people watching this. Now the number is 0, and I see Big G Haywood making a comment. So clearly he's watching, so there's at least one person watching. So I don't know what is going on with these YouTube numbers, right? Now it says 0 people are watching me. And then I see Super Nautiloid saying something, and James Graham saying it's 52. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. I count as 0 now, says JT24. Well, according to the billionaires and bankers that run the country, I guess it is 0. What is going on with these numbers? I have no idea. Now, someone named Sledgehammers Are Racist says it's 52. Are sledgehammers racist? I never thought sledgehammers were racist. I mean, they're just a tool, right? Well, I'm sure it's a joke on some part. I'm sure it's an inside joke. Often when people make names like that, it's like an inside joke of some kind. For a long time when I was in college, just fun little personal anecdote here, not deeply political, I would often make reference to this commercial that was popular when I was a kid, in which a donkey that's supposed to sound like Al Gore says, "I invented pants." And so I used to jokingly say, "I invented pants." And for a while, that was like a joke on the internet. I would say, "I invented pants." It was funny, but, no one got it, right? I mean, if you hadn't been hanging out with me and my friends and hearing me constantly make reference to that commercial that I played in my head over and over again, you wouldn't even know the reference. And that's the whole thing. Inside jokes are fun. Inside jokes are fun. That's why I do the whole thing about... and I'm going to answer your question, Roy Lennon. That's an important point. But that's why I do the whole thing about, what is it called? About, about the beverage that will not be named and all of that, because it's fun, right? We all like to feel like we're part of a fun little community here. So now Rory Lennon asked me, did you smoke weed in college, right? No, I did not. And actually, believe it or not, folks, I have never used any illegal substance in my entire life. Never. Right? When I was a high school student, I loved the musical Hair. I loved Jimi Hendrix music. I was into 60s counterculture because I discovered it and I thought it was very cool and interesting. But at no point have I ever used any illicit substance, actually. And I don't, for whatever reason, I was not properly socialized, I guess you could say. I didn't go to parties. My parents were quite, restrictive. They didn't allow me to have much of a social life in high school. They were very afraid that I would become a criminal or break the law or something. They were very, very afraid. I was in this very, very small town, very, very religious. And for whatever reason, I never actually had the opportunity and never really, and by the time I got political, right, and that's the time that I got to be political later in life, at that point I didn't believe in using drugs, because as a Marxist, Marxism, argues that drugs are not healthy, but looking back on it, I think that legalizing marijuana ultimately would probably be a good policy move. The states that have done it, we're not seeing people dying en masse, I think that marijuana should be legal. And I also think that probably it would help in wiping out the scourge of heroin addiction if it were done above the ground, right? If I'm not saying I want people to be heroin addicts. I don't want, but if it were not something that they were doing in the shadows and buying their heroin from drug cartels, it would be easier to wipe out. And in a lot of cases, I think that the problem with drug use is that outlawing the drugs makes it harder for us to solve the problem of drug addiction. And that if we as a society want to tackle it, we obviously need to control, drug importers, and drug dealers need to be smashed and all of that. But but criminalizing users actually makes it harder to help them, I think, and that's a problem that we have. And I mean, I know a lot of people, especially coming from where I come from and working with young people, and I know a lot of people who have seen the lives of their family members destroyed by drugs. I know people who personally have struggled with drug addiction, and it's heartbreaking. It really is. It really, really is. And one entity that I blame for this problem. And yes, Big Pharma. Hernan says Big Pharma. Sure, I blame Big Pharma, and the fact that they pushed doctors to overprescribe opioid medications. But I also blame the U.S. CIA, MK Ultra. Google it, right? That they were distributing LSD and drugs to college students and very carefully crafting counterculture. And the 1960s counterculture was very, very much the product of efforts by the Central Intelligence Agency. Timothy Leary going around and saying, tune on, turn out, drop out, Timothy Leary and 60s drug culture. I mean, that was very much carefully crafted, and it's got nothing to do with socialism, right? The socialist movement has always been a drug-free movement. In fact, John Reed, right? If you've seen the movie Reds with Warren Beatty, if you read 10 Days That Shook the World, John Reed didn't even drink alcohol. He was a teetotaler. He was a wobbly. He was a friend of the IWW, and most of the wobblies were teetotalers. They didn't believe in drinking alcohol. They thought alcohol was a scourge from capitalism. Right? And in fact, John Reed, according to a book I read, John Reed actually, he was uncomfortable riding around on trains with Bolsheviks because the Bolsheviks loved to drink their vodka. And they were having all these wild parties. And John Reed, he was a wholesome, kind of a conservative, socially conservative American socialist who went to Harvard. And these Bolsheviks were having these wild vodka drinking parties, and John Reed was just not comfortable with it. I think that's an interesting anecdote that doesn't show up in the Warren Beatty movie. But yeah, that's one of the founders of American communism, the journalist John Reed, who wrote 10 Days That Shook the World. He was not happy seeing Bukharin and Zinoviev and Trotsky having their drink it up, chug-a-lug parties as they took him through the southern USSR. And that's part of the movie they do not show, or that's part of John Reed's life they do not show, but that was a big part of the socialist movement. In fact, I bet you didn't know this, or some of you might know this. Interestingly, the feminist movement, not the feminist movement, I should say, the suffrage movement. One of the biggest advocates of women's suffrage was Carrie Nation. She was a woman who went around, and she started out, before she was an advocate of suffrage, she was a Christian preacher who went around advocating temperance and not drinking alcohol. And she did it because she believed in women's rights, because men tended to beat the shit out of their wives when they got drunk. And she saw banning alcohol as a way to advance women's health, and she was a Christian, and so she went around, urging people to stop drinking alcohol, and eventually she started going around urging people to grant women the right to vote. One of the biggest, she was called Carrie Nation. She went around the United States giving fiery speeches, and I believe she was Irish, an Irish-American woman, giving fiery speeches about why women should have the right to vote. She was a radical. She was and all of that. But she started out before she was an advocate of women's rights. She started out being an advocate of temperance and not drinking alcohol. Now, here's a little update for you folks. Interestingly, the views just went from 0 to 57. So 57 people just showed up. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I don't know what is going on with these YouTube numbers. I assume there's some kind of machine malfunction going on, because I've been seeing comments from people all along that it says weren't there, and now we're at 57. So 57 people just walked here. Well, glad you're joining us. Welcome, welcome. I don't know what's going on with YouTube. They're having a difficult time, but hey, at least they let me on here. At least they haven't shut me down and silenced me yet. So there you go. Now, somebody said, Caleb just said a cuss word. Yeah, I did. I'm sorry. I said the shit word I try not to do that. I try not to be profane. I try to be polite. Someone once said, you don't offend anyone by not swearing. That's a very good point. There was a certain socialist group that I was around briefly when I was in college, very briefly. They will not be named. But this particular group, and I think anyone who's been around the rally and protest scene, the movement, will know who I'm referring to, but I'm not going to name names because this is not a sectarian bash fest. I was briefly around them, very briefly. It's not the one that I'm generally associated with. It was one I was just kind of briefly around. And one thing that they were known for was they swore like sailors. Every other word out of these people's mouths was F, 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 F. And they had DVDs of the leader, and he'd be on there, F, 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 and Mother F, and F. And it was childish. It was juvenile, I know what this was about. 60s counterculture, right? That's what it was about, right? It was a 1960s, the weather, weatherman, SDS, that was their legacy. And it was these older 60s radicals walking around. They've been doing it since 1968, 67, 63, and so they're walking around, mother effer, F and A, whatever, and that was part of it. But then the other thing that someone told me, and I didn't realize this, is it more than a 60s radical thing. The reason that this group in particular walks around and all their members are constantly like, F that, F, just dropping the F-bomb like crazy. Part of the reason that they do that isn't necessarily their 1960s radical history. It's actually, interestingly, it comes out of their history, lo and behold, with the new communist movement, right? Because after the upsurge of the 60s, the new communist movement, the NCM, they all got jobs in factories. And they were trying to very much be working class. And they believed that swearing was working class, right? And that this group, apparently they don't act this way now, but they used to introduce themselves, instead of saying, I'm a member of this political party, they would say, I'm just an ordinary working man. Yes, I am. And they would wear hats with beer on them, with the beer companies, hats with the logos of beer companies, and jean jackets, and they'd have a job in the factory, and they'd be like, I'm a communist, and you ought to be effing with me, man, F, F, F. And it was part of the swearing, the compulsive swearing that this group carried out, was that they were all, wealthy kids who went to Harvard and Yale and, were in Students for a Democratic Society, went to rallies, and then the great leader of the revolutionary organization told them to pretend to be working class. So they were working a job in a factory going, F this, man, F, I'm an ordinary working man. It was kind of funny. And then they gave up on that. And then, starting in the late 70s, they started to declare that only the black masses could lead a revolution, only the low-income African-American workers. Very interesting history, and that particular group, they're still around. People see them. Now, Nikki Gallo says, you're from Ohio. Do people there still have vigils to remember the Kent State Massacre? Yes. And actually, I'm glad that you asked, Nikki Gallo. I was going to talk about that, May 4th was a week ago. I went to the opera with my wife, and then I did a live on Sunday. I didn't end up talking about this, but I wanted to talk about this because, I knew about the Kent State Massacre when I was little, right? Before I knew anything about anti-war protests or history or communism or Marxism, I knew about the Kent State Massacre of 1970. The reason I knew about it is because I grew up about maybe 30 minutes away from Kent State University. Kent State University, it has this reputation, because of the massacre that happened there in 1970, it has this reputation as being a very radical school. But anyone who's been there, it's not. It is not. It is a state university that exists in the middle of farm country, surrounded by cornfields. And that's what it was back in 1970. And I grew up in this very, very small town in Ohio. It's actually the town where Smucker's jelly is made, lo and behold. That's where I grew up. Not that far from Kent State University. And as a kid, I was a kid in the 90s. People were still talking about the Kent State Massacre. You get these older folks, they're a lot older now, but they were, middle-aged back then. And they'd be sitting there and saying constantly, constantly they'd be saying things like, those students deserved it. They should have shot more of them. They were disrespecting America. They were disrespecting our troops. I wish they had killed more of them. It was ridiculous. And I heard this constantly. These students had been protesting the war. They were anti-American and they deserved to die. And I heard this constantly. And what this really was, now I understand it. What this really was people who had been there, been around at the time, maybe knew people who were there, because I know all the surrounding police departments were like occupying Kent State University during that time. And these were people who lived through that and were deeply disturbed by it. And they weren't trying to tell me that these students had deserved to die. They were trying to tell themselves that. Because if you think about it, these students at Kent State University, they'd been having a peaceful demonstration. Two of the people who were killed were not even at the demonstration. They were just students who were hit by stray bullets. Two of them who were killed, Allison Krauss and Jeffrey Miller. They were part of the peaceful rally that was happening. 30 feet away from the nearest National Guard state trooper, gunned down. And how can you not be disturbed by that? Right? That even if you, and they would talk about all those students said bad words, and those students were disrespectful of America, and those students did drugs, and they had this whole tirade against the students, but none of the things they said were worthy of the death penalty. Right? Are we going to implement the death penalty for swearing? Are we going to implement the death penalty for cursing? Are we going to implement the death penalty for vandalism? Are we going to... No, these students, lo and behold, they had been marching against the war, and they were shot, killed. And two of the four who were killed hadn't even been part of the rally. They were just hit by stray bullets. So lo and behold, as these people were walking through life 2-3 decades later, in the presence of small children like myself, saying, those students deserve to die, they should have shot more of them, they're saying that it's them trying to reassure themselves that what happened was okay. On some level, they're disturbed by it. And you can hear that a lot. A lot of times there are things that people say over and over and over again that don't make a lot of sense. And the reason that they're saying it, lo and behold, is because they're telling it to themselves. They're not telling it to you. They're telling it to themselves. When you hear people repeating themselves over and over and over again, and I was a kid, did I know anything about the Vietnam War? Did I know anything about anti-war protesters? No. So why are they saying it in my presence? They're not telling it to me. My teachers were not telling that to me. My, coworkers and my parents, people I knew in town, would always, whenever that massacre would come up, they should have shot more of them. You don't know how awful these kids are. They weren't telling that to me. They were telling that to themselves. Because on some level, they knew that Jeffrey Miller and Allison Krauss did not deserve to die for attending a peaceful anti-war rally on their college campus, for goodness sakes. And that the other two students who were killed, they weren't even part of the rally. They were just students who just happened to be hit by stray bullets. And that what happened there was deeply, deeply disturbing. The Kent State Massacre was horrendous. It was a horrendous, horrendous event. I remember when the governor, the governor of Ohio, I believe it was Governor Rhodes, he had been governor of Ohio when that massacre had happened. And I remember when he died, and they played the clip on him, the clip of him sending the National Guard to Kent State University. They played that clip on the news after his death, because it was big. And he had said, these students that are protesting the war, they're worse than the brown shirts, worse than the night riders, worse than the communist element. So they're worse than the Nazis, worse than the Ku Klux Klan, worse than the Communist Party even. That was this governor, by giving this inflammatory speech and sending the military of the state of Ohio to Kent State University. He was setting the stage for a massacre. On top of that, a lot of the National Guardsmen who had been sent had been battling Teamsters. There was a Teamsters strike all throughout the state of Ohio. The truck drivers were on strike. And the truck drivers back then, again, you wouldn't know this, but back then, truck drivers in Ohio, when they went on strike, it wasn't a joke. They were Teamsters, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. And those guys were rough and tough back then. That was the day of Jimmy Hoffa. That was the days of Jimmy Hoffa. And those guys were rough and tough, and things got rough on the picket line. So the National Guard that had been sent to Kent, Ohio, had been sending a couple weeks, getting hit with baseball bats and dealing with Teamsters, who were rather militant back in the day. So they were already stressed out, tired, wanted to go home. They're National Guard, right? They probably signed up for the National Guard so they didn't have to go to Vietnam. They wanted to guard Ohio and not fight in Vietnam. So those guys were stressed out and worked up. And then you had Governor Rhodes, the governor of Ohio, say, these students that are protesting are worse than the brown shirts, worse than the night riders, worse than the communist element even. And he's getting them all fired up. And furthermore, apparently among the National Guardsmen, there were rumors that the students had snipers on the roof. And it wasn't true, and no one knows where those rumors came from. But the National Guardsmen were constantly afraid that there were snipers on the roofs of the buildings. The students didn't have any guns. They weren't shooting at them. But it was an intense situation, and it boiled over into a massacre. And that was a particularly crazy incident. Now, what happened before, the way things, escalated was that, it had been announced that Richard Nixon had expanded the U.S. war in Vietnam into Cambodia. Nixon had been promising that he was scaling down the war in Vietnam. Lo and behold, it was revealed, it became public information, that the war in Vietnam had expanded to Cambodia. And so as a result of that, there were protests all across the country because everyone wanted the war to end. Nixon had promised that he would end the war. Everyone was saying they were going to end the war. Nixon was saying he would bring an honorable end to the war in Vietnam. The Democrats had been saying, yeah, we were going to scale back. Everybody had said they were going to end the Vietnam War. Everyone was being told that the USA was reducing its military presence. Lo and behold, Nixon had been lying, and they had actually been expanding the war into Cambodia. So lo and behold, there were protests all over the country. All over the country, students just walked out of class and protested against it. In Kent, Ohio, they had a small anti-war rally. This is Kent, Ohio. This is farm country. This is rural Ohio. These are small town kids. This is not Berkeley, right? This is not, the Greenwich Village, right? This is a really small rural community, a very small student organization of Students for Democratic Society at Kent State University, which was not a lot of people. It was 10, 20 students, 30 students had an anti-war rally. And their anti-war rally they had, I know there were some activists from surrounding areas joined them. And in response to that, they closed all the bars. They closed all the bars in Kent. And the police in Kent, as they closed the bars on Friday night, drinking night at Kent State University, as they closed the bars on everyone's favorite drinking night, the cops were not exactly nice to people as they were kicking people out of the bars because, oh, look, there's an anti-war rally, so you can't drink tonight. And so a lot of the students who weren't really political, as they, lo and behold, they were not really political, they were not really political, and they were getting kicked around by the police. The police were also kicking around the protesters, and it exploded into something big. And we know that the building that belonged to the ROTC, the Reserve Officer Training Corps, that's like the military organization on the college campus at Kent State University, got burned down. We then know that as a result of that, James Rhodes, or was it Governor Rhodes, got on TV. I think it was Rhodes. Maybe the name is escaping me, but he got on TV. And he sent the military to Kent. Boiling situation. It was basically martial law. The students were forbidden from having rallies. So, of course, they were having rallies to make a point that they had the right to free speech. They were assembling and having their rallies. They would get tear gas shot at them and then finally on May 4th, they opened fire not with tear gas, but with live ammo and killed 4 of the students. It was just a horrendous incident. A few days later, they opened fire at Jackson State. There was an anti-war rally at Jackson State University, and the local police and state troopers opened fire and killed 2 of the students at Jackson State University, an African-American campus, 2 days later. So Jackson State, 2 days later, Kent State University. It was a disaster. It was a horrendous occurrence. But yes, I heard my whole life older folks going, they should have shot more of them. They were disrespecting America. There's a lot of people on the internet, it's not for me to do, but, who debunk that whole they spit on the soldiers thing. Because I heard that nonstop, too, when I was growing up, right? Well, you can't protest the war in Iraq, Caleb. You have to support the war in Iraq. You have to support George Bush invading Iraq. Because when the Vietnam War happened, people opposed the war, and they spit on soldiers. So, therefore, you're not allowed to protest the war in Iraq. Now, don't take my word for it. A lot of Vietnam veterans dispute that whole spitting on soldiers thing. They dispute it. They say that's not what happened. And there's a lot of videos. There's a documentary film, Sir, No Sir. It was made, and it gets into the fact that actually the anti-war movement had a very good relationship with soldiers, and that there were a lot of soldiers. There was the American Servicemen's Union. There was the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. The American Servicemen's Union was tied to the Workers' World Party, and it was organizing the soldiers, bringing anti-war messages to them. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War was tied to the Revolutionary Communist Party, and it was also organizing soldiers and organizing against the war. And lo and behold, John Kerry was in it. Now, he was never with the Revolutionary Communist Party, but he was in Vietnam Veterans Against the War. That there was, that actually the anti-war movement made big efforts to be very friendly with the soldiers. Now, I'm not saying, I wasn't there, right? I mean, maybe the spitting on soldiers thing happened. I wasn't there, right? But there is video. There's a documentary, Sir No Sir, where they contest it. And it was in the movie Rambo, right? I mean, we've all seen Rambo, First Blood, Rambo, and he's like, they spit on me. I'm Sylvester Stallone, and I got back from Vietnam, and they spit on me, these maggots. I'm mad about it. And that put into the public consciousness. And then that was a big thing I heard my whole life. Oh, you can't protest a war because during the 60s, people protested the war and they spit on soldiers, so therefore you're not allowed to protest the war. Well, the untold story is the fact that the anti-war movement made a big point of reaching out to the soldiers. There were a lot of, in fact, and that's one thing I've seen as I've been in left circles, there's a lot of Vietnam veterans that are in leftist and communist groups. A lot of them. For a lot, of guys who fought in Vietnam, they came back to the United States really mad at the system, really fired up and really questioning the lies that were told. Jesse Ventura, the governor of Minnesota, great guy. I mean, and he was a Vietnam War veteran, and he saw that the Gulf of Tonkin was a lie, and he's been one of the biggest critics of U.S. wars and really a big critic of U.S. foreign policy. Again, this narrative that the anti-war movement hated the soldiers and was disrespecting the soldiers, and that all these students were just a bunch of disrespectful people who deserved to be killed for disrespecting America. That's what I heard growing up, and it wasn't the truth. It's interesting to look at these historical narratives. But again, the reason that all those people were repeating that is they were telling themselves that. They weren't telling that to me. I mean, I was, I'm a kid, 8, 9, 10 years old, and they're telling me these people. Now, somebody keeps asking about the General Assemblies in NYC at Occupy Wall Street and asking about different approaches. Look, I was part of Occupy Wall Street, and I was actually, I've put in a lot of my biographies that I was at the early planning stages of Occupy Wall Street. Because that's true. I, was there on August 2nd when the first General Assembly happened on Wall Street. That was the day of the debt ceiling crisis. And New Yorkers Against Budget Cuts, that was a couple different Marxist and socialist groups had rallies, protesting the debt ceiling crisis. And some anarchists came, and there were some disagreements about how to proceed and should the media be there to cover it and such. And then I went to some more General Assemblies they had in one of the parks in New York City. I was new to the city at the time, but I think it was Tompkins Square Park on the Lower East Side where I went, and they had some General Assemblies, and I was part of that. And I was a member of a particular Marxist group at the time, so I was following the party line, and I was coordinating with my comrades like you're supposed to when you're in a communist group. But I saw Occupy Wall Street happen, and I was in on the inside of it, right? The inside baseball of Occupy Wall Street. There's a saying that people say it's always, you always enjoy sausage the less you know about how it's made. And that's true about political movements, I think. I was in on a lot of those early discussions. I saw how things were going, and it was, it's not as glorious. There's a lot of histories of Occupy Wall Street that have been published that make it sound like it was all, and trust me, it was weird, the first week of Occupy Wall Street, it was not that big. It got a lot of publicity, and the first day, there were like whole busloads of students that were there the first day of Occupy Wall Street, where they were marching. I remember getting, there's this really long escalator in what is it? It's Liberty Plaza, I believe. Or no, it's not Liberty Plaza. It's this really long Bowling Green Plaza near Wall Street, right? There's this really, really long escalator to get up from the subway. And I remember on the day that Occupy Wall Street was set to begin, September 17th, 2011, I was in that escalator with a couple other people, and it's this long escalator, and we're going up the stairs, and I'm thinking, I have no idea what is going to be up at the top of these stairs. I have no clue, right? Occupy Wall Street was getting a lot of play, Adbusters magazine and all of this, but it was weird. I had no idea what was going to be at the top of those stairs. And so I'm going up the top of the stairs. And what I saw when I got up to the top of those stairs made me very, very happy. I will say, put a smile on my face. Because what I saw at the top of those stairs, I was very afraid of what was going to be there. I didn't know what it was going to be. When I got to the top of those stairs, I saw a decent crowd of a couple hundred people marching in a circle around the bowl with signs that said things like money out of politics, kind of liberal slogans. And it was nice to see what was there. And then, I was there for a few hours. I went uptown. I came back a few hours later, and it was in Zuccotti Park at that point. But then, I came back in a couple days. I think there were, I was working at an insurance firm at that time. And so there were some holidays. And so I had some days off work. And so I went down there. And, the first couple of days, it wasn't that big. Things really blew up. There was the execution of Troy Davis, the African-American man in Georgia who was executed, even though overwhelming evidence showed he was innocent. There were protests about that got pretty rowdy. Then the following day, the police arrested a bunch of people. There was the macing of the people, and then it was big, and then it was all over the news. But yeah, Occupy Wall Street was an interesting experience. I'm going to write about it at some point, But yeah, I hope that answers your question. I don't want to get into, who did what and what political group did this and. You really hate to generalize. At the time I was in this political group that identified as Marxist, Leninist, or Communist, but the way we operated was far different than the way other Marxist, Leninist, or Communist groups operated. And the way people who call themselves anarchists operated, some of them, was very different than the way other people who called themselves anarchists operated. You can't make generalized statements like that. There are many different interpretations. Not every Christian is like a Jehovah's Witness. Not every Muslim is like Saudi Arabia. And not every anarchist is the same way. Not every communist is the same way. There are other communists on YouTube. Someone named Comrade Pinky is bringing up another guy on YouTube. Well, the way I see things, the way he sees things are different. I respect him for the work he does. He respects me. We don't agree necessarily on everything. But that's how things go. And that, more and more, you have to live by a principle of live and let live, right? It's important to state your view. It's important to advocate for what you think is true, but it's also important to recognize not everyone's always going to agree with you. And that, that it's better to focus sometimes on what you have in common than what you disagree with people about. Now, someone's asking me, am I writing an autobiography? Well, the answer to that is no. That is no. I am not writing an autobiography. I'm on the verge of publishing a new book that will be coming out. And I've hinted some of what it will be about. But I'm not going to say too much about it. Not an autobiography. Not an autobiography. I'll write an autobiography when I'm old. When I'm 75, I'll write an autobiography. But right now, I'm writing about the world as it exists. I don't think people are interested enough in me as an individual and my personal life and feelings. Maybe they will be someday. But at this point, I don't think people want to hear autobiographical stuff from me. Maybe you do. I don't know, right? That's one thing. That's one thing, that as much as... Now, someone is determined that I answer a question. They're saying, Caleb, answer, in all capital letters. But repeat the question. I don't know what the question is, so you're going to have to... I want to answer all your questions here. These lives are pointless if I don't answer your questions. So whoever asked that with all the capital letters there, ask your question again, and I'll try to answer it. Third-worldism, I'm being asked about. That's what you're asking. Well, I've addressed that before. Okay, so here's the thing. The premise of third-worldism... Right? And again, we're getting into real commie inside baseball here. Most people you talk to and they're like, I'm a third worldist man. And they're going to look at you like you're a what? A woulda? I try not to get into this stuff too much, but hey, why not? Okay, so among people who call themselves communists, there is one trend of people that they call third worldists. And what it is it points to Lenin's theory of imperialism. And it points to a lot of things about Lenin's theory of imperialism that are correct. Lenin wrote his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And it's a very good book. And it's about economics. And I encourage people to read that book. People need to read Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. If you want to understand how the global economy works, read that book. He documents everything that he says. It's a great book. Read Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. In that book, Lenin explains how the global economy has changed basically since Karl Marx's time. and how basically the Western countries have picked sections of the developing world and they're using them as spheres of influence, and they're keeping them underdeveloped in order to maintain a monopoly, right? And that, the countries like India wasn't able to grow its own, have its own textile industry. It was forced to import cloth from Britain, right? African countries were being carved out, and that these countries in the developing world are kept in a state of underdevelopment by imperialism, right? They're kept poor so that the Western monopolists and monopolies, right? That's what Lenin writes about. He writes about the cartels, international conglomerates, centralization of capital, and banking taking precedence over industrial capital, how these entities that dominate the world economy keep the world poor, and they keep the developing world poor. And Lenin points out in that book very, very well that one of the aspects of imperialism is the stratification of the working class at home and the creation of a labor aristocracy, or an aristocracy of labor. And he talks about the fact that in the homeland of imperialism, you have a layer that develops of workers, people that sell their labor power, construction workers, skilled trades, craftsmen, and they're workers. They're working class, they're in unions. But because they are higher paid than other workers, they stop being revolutionary. They don't want to seize the means of production, and they're pro-imperialist because, hey, look, their standard of living goes up, right, along with imperialism. So, imperialism is good for them, and they really feel hostile to the lower income workers, the so-called unskilled workers, the industrial workers, the workers of different nationalities. In Britain, it was like the Irish workers. In the USA, it's always been, the black masses, African Americans, but also at this time in history, immigrants that were Roman Catholic, that they tend to have racist, national chauvinist sentiments. They tend to sympathize with the imperialists and with capitalism because their standard of living is going up. Their standard of living is going up as imperialism rides high. So they tend to be not revolutionary. They're the aristocracy of labor. That's what Lenin wrote about, and it's a real thing, and it happens. So that's a real phenomenon, and a lot of leftists won't address that. A lot of leftists don't want to pretend that doesn't exist, but it's real. And Lenin wrote that because at that time, when he's writing this book in like 1914 or 1916, at the time Lenin's writing his book, he says, look, the revolutionary energy is not going to be in Britain and France and Germany and the United States because those countries have this labor aristocracy. A lot of the working class has been bought off, right? That they have entered this alliance with imperialism, and the revolution is going to happen instead in the developing world, in the colonized world, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. Lo and behold, it's going to happen there because these countries are being kept poor by imperialism. And that in the Western countries, the labor aristocracy is ultimately going to prevent the development of a revolution. And that's all correct. And Lenin took it a step further and said that World War I happened because the labor unions and the socialist parties in Germany and France and Britain and the United States, a lot of them were dominated by these higher paid workers that weren't revolutionary, and they went along and supported the war. And they could have stopped the war, but they didn't. And the Social Democrats in Germany and the flagship Marxist Party, they voted to start World War I. It happened, right? That's all true. And third worldists, when they point all that stuff out, they're not lying. However, they're kind of missing the point. And the point is, right, that Lenin did not say at any point that labor aristocracy, the aristocracy of labor, made it impossible for Western countries to ever have socialism. He didn't say that. Never said that. And in fact, you should read his letter to the American working class, where he basically says that he believes one day the USA would become socialist. Right? And he believed that there was a revolutionary current within the American people. And that the third worldist current, they take what is true that Lenin wrote and they expand it into a law, right? That it could never happen. Never could we ever have socialism in the United States because, lo and behold, labor aristocracy. And it's one thing to say that in the 50s and 60s, because if you thought the labor aristocracy in the United States was big in the 20s and teens, it was really big in the 50s, really big in the 60s, 70s, even up into the 80s. But what we're seeing right now in the Western world is the demolition of the labor aristocracy. That's what's happening all over the Western world. The labor aristocracy is being demolished. Wages are going down. The capitalist ruling class, because of automation, no longer needs a labor aristocracy. Homes are being foreclosed all over the Midwest, right? The rate of household debt is through the roof. The skilled trades, those high-paid factory workers, those construction trades, it's over, right? They are demolishing the ruling class of the United States. The ruling class of the Western world is getting rid of the labor aristocracy. And that opens the door to solidarity like never before. As workers in the Western countries are seeing their wages go down, there's an opening for them to realize that they have a common struggle with people all over the world that are fighting for their liberation. So the third worldists, they're pointing to something true, but they're missing the point. That this barrier, this problem of labor aristocracy, which has held back revolutionary movements for so long and made it hard to talk about workers in the United States and convince them to be socialist, is vanishing. And now there's this great opportunity where for the first time in a generation, we got people in the United States from, working class people in the United States that would be open to hearing socialist ideas. That's the point. That's the point. And so these folks that are third worldists, I understand it. I really do. I really do. Because when I was a young kid growing up in Ohio, in my rural town, where all these people that were working in a factory that had a union were telling me that if I didn't support the war in Iraq, I needed to move to another country, and I was disrespecting America, and oh my God, I could tell you some horror stories. I mean, just getting shouted at in front of whatever. I'm not going to get into all my personal gripes, but regardless, I'd say when I was in high school, when I was first getting interested in Marxist and socialist ideas, I was a third worldist. I thought, you know what, the working class of the United States is too bought off. It's too comfortable. They'll never be won to socialism, and I was bitter and I was frustrated, and that's leftists in the first world. I mean, you want to go back to the '60s, the New Left. You read some of the stuff that was put out by like Bill Ayers and Bernardine Dorn and all of that. That was what that was based on. I know that the anarchist writer Ward Churchill, he really pushes this line about the labor aristocracy. Americans are to blame. Americans are the exploiters. It's not the ruling class. It's the average Americans that are the problem. I know there's this book, Settlers, The Mythology of the White Proletariat. It's very popular. It says all of the white people in the United States are not workers. They're settlers. They're bosses. There's another book by Zachary Cope. It's called Divided World, Divided Class. And it says that Nazi Germany was a working class movement and that workers benefited from Nazi Germany and that they're the exploiters. This is a widespread trend among, I would say, the ultra-left in the United States. And it's rooted in frustration. Young people that are frustrated. They just see, so many backward sentiments among the working class of the United States, and they want to just, turn it into a law. But the thing is, that's what you can call catastrophizing. Things are bad. This is an aspect, right? There's a section of the U.S. working class that, they're so comfortable that they are, that they are not interested in socialism. But lo and behold, nothing is permanent in the universe. That's what dialectical materialism and Marxism is all about, right? It's the understanding that A can never equal A. I might have some fun with this. I'm even going to write this out for you. A can never equal A. To be a Marxist, you have to understand that, I'm going to write it out for you. That A can never equal this A. There's no way that this A that I just drew could be the same as that A. That history is constantly changing. This A cannot equal that A, right? That there is constant change in the universe. There is no repeating. There is no copying, right? That the world is constantly in flux. That's dialectical materialism. And that understanding, that frustration that these people that call themselves third worldists have, is rooted in the fact that they see that right now it's difficult to convince certain people of being socialists because they're too comfortable and bought off. So it's always going to be that way. That's the problem. It's always going to be that way. Always going to be that way. Never going to change. And so they change their entire worldview. They rewrite Marxism to be based on this assumption that working class people in the Western countries can never be convinced of being socialists. And they're wrong. They're wrong. Because right now, especially, we are seeing a demolition of the labor aristocracy. That's what we're seeing. And they're missing the point. They're really missing the point. and I sympathize with them. Chippy Phillips is saying, well, do you think that they're being lazy? Well, no, I don't want to put it on them like that. I understand. And trust me, if I were living in another part of the country, if I were not in New York City where there's this progressive sentiment everywhere, if I were not surrounded by people who are a little more, people know that I work with people that are a little more aware of what the U.S. does around the world. But unfortunately, it can be difficult. It can be very difficult, and people get frustrated. But you have to remember, in that frustration, don't project the frustrations of today onto all of human history. And don't assume that your frustrations or the difficulties that you face are permanent. And on top of that, notice actual trends that are happening. If you were talking about labor aristocracy in the 50s, you might have a point. But right now, the labor aristocracy is being demolished, so they're completely missing the point. That's what I think about third worldism. I know there's a lot of really good people that maybe think that way, especially a lot of African American folks that are maybe they view socialism in terms of black nationalism. They're not interested in organizing the white working class. They see it as a white oppressor, and that's their business, right? And I'm not here to put down anybody. I'm not trying to say these people are stupid or I'm just telling you how I see it. And the way I see it, third worldism is not correct. It is an incorrect analysis. It's a mistake. It's a miscalculation. They're taking things that are true and they're blowing them up into things that are not true. That's my assessment. So I hope that answers your question. Now, I've been going here, even though they shut down my initial stream, I've been going here for quite some time. So I think I'm going to wrap it up, but save your question for the next time. Somebody asked me about Indonesia, right? I'm going to comment on that real quick. I'm just going to talk about that. Indonesia, 1965. There was a military coup d'etat in which the socialist president was toppled, and there was a massacre. They were killing the communists, and then that massacre in Indonesia escalated from simply being a massacre of communists to being a genocide against ethnically Chinese people. Horrendous event. Nobody talks about it. Nobody ever talks about it, right? The horrendous crime that took place in Indonesia in 1965. At least 500,000 people killed. Bodies just dumped into rivers. I mean, just awful stuff. No one ever talks about it. And another thing they don't talk about is who was living in Indonesia at the time that it happened. Who was living in Indonesia at that time? A 10-year-old or small child named Barack Obama. Right? Barack Obama was living in Indonesia as a child at that point. He was living there because his mother, Ann Dunham, was married to a general in the Indonesian military, one of the people who was carrying out the massacre. You heard that right. There was a genocide in Indonesia in 1965, in which they started killing communists, and then they escalated it to just killing entire communities of ethnically Chinese people. Barack Obama was living there in Indonesia when it happened, and Barack Obama's mother was married to a general who was carrying out the massacre. No one ever talks about this. No one ever talks about this, right? That Barack Obama, his mother, was married to somebody who was complicit in a genocide against ethnically Chinese people, that he was living in Indonesia and living in a household with a stepfather who was a mass murderer, who was involved in a genocide, and that his mother, Ann Dunham, was married, and that he was, nobody talks about this. All they talked about, the right wing talked about, Obama went to a radical Muslim school in Indonesia. They're missing the point. Missing the point entirely. Radical Muslim school wasn't a thing in 1965. Islam, people weren't worried about Muslim terrorists back then. That wasn't a thing, right? In 1965, the U.S. media was all about hating communists. And one of the things that happened in 1965 was that Barack Obama, the 10-year-old boy, was living there, and Ann Dunham, his mother, was married to a high-ranking military leader, and the military of Indonesia toppled the elected government and then launched a genocide against ethnically Chinese people and killed 500,000 people in Indonesia. It is a horrendous occurrence, and it is wiped out of history. Nobody talks about it in the United States. It's like it doesn't exist. And there is a long history. Saudi Arabia is very much funding Islam in Indonesia and in Malaysia, and that the Wahhabi, the Saudi pro-U.S., extremist Wahhabi brand of Islam, the interpretation of Islam that's practiced in Saudi Arabia, has a lot of sway in Malaysia and in Indonesia and in a lot of these places. Um, and that a lot of that Wahhabism in that region, the Philippines and elsewhere, that Wahhabi Saudi brand of Islamic, radicalism or whatever, a lot of that is about hating ethnically Chinese people. There's a whole history of, just massacres of ethnically Chinese people in the region. And that, it's a whole thing that's going on in that part of the world. And now, as they play up the idea that China is oppressing Muslims in the Uyghur regions, now there's an attempt. The Saudi media and a lot of the media coming out of the Muslim world is really trying to incite Muslims in that region to go after ethnically Chinese people again. It's a disaster. It really is. So on that glum note, I try to be optimistic. I really do, right? Because I feel like optimism is the way to challenge the pessimism that comes from the ruling elite. There's some voices that put out a very pessimistic leftist message, and I feel like they're not helping. I feel like we need left optimism. Socialism, Marxism is about optimism. It's about the idea that we can get to something better. We can build something beautiful if human beings and human reason can control the means of production. And so I'm optimistic, and socialism for me is all about optimism. It's a reason to wake up in the morning. It's the hope that we can get to something better in the world. It's planning the economy. We need socialist optimism. We need utopianism. We need people to think beautifully, to think about what we can build if we get beyond capitalism. That's what we need. And we need that more than ever. And I urge anyone who considers himself to be a socialist to try and promote an optimistic message. Try to unleash creativity and a vision. Try to present socialism in a way that cheers people up and makes people believe. I like those crowds of millennials chanting "Not me, us," as I mentioned earlier. That's what we need more than ever. We need socialist optimism, socialist hope. That's what we need. So on that note, folks, I'm winding it down. Have a lovely evening. I love you all. I love you lurkers. I love you fans. I love you haters. We're all friends.